Good afternoon. I'm Ryan Hill. Glad to be back. Another series or another session of our Black Inventor series. Today we're going to talk about George Speck. He was the inventor, or thought to be the inventor, of the potato chip. He was born in 1824 and he died in 1914. George Speck, also known as George Crum, was an American chef. He was known for his role in popularizing potato chips in upstate New York and was later mythologized as their creator. Speck was born in Saratoga County, New York, upstate New York. He was a member of the Mohawk people and likely also had African American ancestry. He worked as a hunter, guide, and cook in the Adirondack Mountains, becoming noted for his culinary skills after being hired at Moon's Lake House near Saratoga Springs. So he was a cook at Moon's Lake House, Saratoga Springs, also with his sister Kate at Moon's Lake House. George Speck's specialties included wild meat, especially venison and duck. Speck later left Moon's and opened his own restaurant, which was called Crum's, in a town called Malta, a nearby town called Malta. So Malta was adjacent to Saratoga. It was in Saratoga County. His establishment was popular among wealthy tourists, and his reputation spread outside the Adirondacks. See, the Adirondacks, beautiful. I've never been, but heard about it, upstate Saratoga. A lot of the rich Manhattanites would go up there in the summer and all year round and had cabins up there and everything. So he really had a wealthy crowd, a discerning crowd that he was serving with his culinary delights. Speck was known for serving thinly sliced fried potatoes at his restaurants, which subsequently became known as Saratoga chips. The first published recipes for potato chips date from the early 19th century, decades before his career as a chef. However, after Speck's death, various newspaper articles and local histories of Saratoga County began to claim him as the inventor of potato chips. This myth featured in national advertising campaigns in the 1970s. More detailed versions include claims that he invented potato chips by accident or to appease a difficult customer, often cited as Cornelius Vanderbilt. Some accounts also claim that the true inventor was Speck's sister, Catherine Wicks. And I've read two different things. One, that Vanderbilt was not happy with the potatoes or French fries. He thought they were too soggy, soft, unappealing. And so, what I read was that Speck went in and threw some potatoes in the fryer, in the oil, and they came out crispy. And he came back and put them on a plate for Cornelius Vanderbilt, as if to say, hey, this won't be too soggy. Take this, So it was really one account was that he did it to satisfy or to spite a disgruntled customer or dissatisfied customer. The other account I heard was that it was an accident. His sister Kate, George Speck's sister Kate, who was also cooked there and working at the Moon's Lodge, was cutting some potatoes, I guess, and nicked a piece off accidentally. It fell in the pot. It fell in the grease, the fat, and she pulled it out, forked it out, and put it on a plate next to George Speck, and he tasted it, and he said, we're going to have plenty of these. So it was one or the other. It was either him throwing it in there saying, hey, this won't be too soft. I'll hard fry these potatoes. And that's either how the chip came that way or by mistake with his sister Kate chopping and cutting and a piece falling into the fat. So those were the two accounts I heard of how the potato chip was actually invented or formed. It had been early accounts in England of it with Kitchener, but those are the two accounts that I heard how it took off. But Speck was known for serving thinly sliced fried potatoes in his restaurants, which subsequently became known as Saratoga chips. The first published recipes for potato chips date from the early 19th century, decades before his career as a chef, like we were saying. However, after Speck's death, various newspaper articles and local histories of Saratoga County began to claim him as the inventor of potato chips. This myth featured in national advertising campaigns in the 1970s. More detailed versions include claims that he invented potato chips by accident, or like we said, or to appease a difficult customer. Often cited as Cornelius Vanderbilt, some accounts also claim that the true inventor was Speck's sister, Catherine, and they called her Kate. Catherine, Aunt Kate Wicks. Early life. Speck was born on July 15th, 1824 in Saratoga County, upstate New York. Though information about his actual heritage is unclear, he has been assumed to be African American and mixed race. Speck and his sister Catherine Wicks both identified as members of the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, Native American tribe. Speck developed his culinary skills at Carey's Moon Lake House on Saratoga Lake, like we were talking about, noted as an expensive restaurant at a time when wealthy families from Manhattan and other areas were building summer camps in the area. Speck and his sister Wicks also cooked at the Sansuchi in Boston Spa, alongside another St. Regis Mohawk Indian known for his skills as a guide and cook, Pete Francis. One of the regular customers at Moon's was shipping tycoon Cornelius Bennett that we mentioned earlier. Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Bennett was a linebacker for the Bills. Cornelius Vanderbilt. Who, although he savored the food, could never seem to remember Speck's name. So he loved Speck's cooking, but he couldn't remember his name. On one occasion, he called a waiter over to ask Crum. He said, "Crum, how long before we shall eat?" And so he said he would rather than take offense. Speck decided to embrace the nickname, figuring that a crumb is bigger than a speck. So he called him Crum, got his name wrong, but he didn't take offense. He said, rather than take offense, a crumb is bigger than a speck. His name was Speck, but he said a crumb is bigger than a speck, and he would name his restaurant Crumbs. When he left Carey's lodge house, Carey Moon's lake house, When he left that and started his own restaurant in Malta, he would call that Crumbs. By 1860, Speck had opened his own restaurant called Crumbs on Story Hill in nearby Malta, New York. His cuisine was in high demand among Saratoga Springs tourists and elites. His prices were those of the fashionable New York restaurants. So they were just like the fashionable Manhattan restaurants, the prices were, but his food and service were worth it. Everything possible was raised on his own small farm, and that too got his personal attention whenever he could arrange it. So he had his own personal small farm, ducks, venison. He had all kind of stuff he was raising, probably had a fish farm too, a fish lake, According to popular accounts, he was said to include a basket of chips on every table. So just like bread, he put a basket of potato chips on every table. One contemporaneous source recalls that in his restaurant, Speck was unquestionably the man in charge. His rules of procedure were his own. They were very strict, and being an Indian, he never departed from them. In the slang of the race course, he played no favorites. Guests were obliged to wait their turn, the millionaires as well as the wage earners. So he had millionaires, many great Manhattanites, many socialites, great Gatsby types. But hey, they had to wait in line for their duck, their venison, their steak like everyone else. The Vanderbilts didn't go to the head of the line. He had to wait behind the sanitation worker, behind the factory worker. So he played no favorites in his restaurant. It said with none but rich pleasure seekers as his guests, Speck kept his tables laden with the best of everything, and for it all charged Delmonico prices. So his tables were laden with the best of everything, and he charged Delmonico prices. But I like how he did not favor one patron over the next. Whoever was in line first was next, and they got the same attention and care as anyone else in service. After his death, a local legend developed which credited Speck with the invention of the potato chip. However, according to Snoops, he never made the claim that he had invented the potato chip, let alone claim the tale as his own. Those assertions emerged only many years after his death. Recipes for frying potato slices were published in several cookbooks in the 19th century. In 1832, a recipe for fried potato shavings was included in the United States cookbook, derived from an earlier English collection. William Kitchener, I mentioned earlier, the Cook's Oracle, 1817, also included techniques for such a dish. And Kitchener, the Cook's Own book, too, N.K.M. Lee cookbook, the Cook's Own book, 1832, had a recipe that is very similar to Kitchener's. The New York Tribune ran a feature article on Crumb's, the famous eating house on Saratoga Lake. It was a famous eating house on Saratoga Lake in December 1891, but mentioned nothing about potato chips. Neither did Crumb's commissioned biography published in 1893, nor did one 1914 obituary in a local paper. Another obituary states Crum is said to have been the actual inventor of Saratoga chips. When Wicks died in 1924, however, her obituary authoritatively identified her as follows: a sister of George Crum. We were talking about Catherine Wicks, or Kate Wicks. Mrs. Catherine Wicks died at the age of 102, his sister. But this was in her obituary, and was a cook at Moon's Lake House. She first invented and fried the famous Saratoga chips. Wicks recalled, and as I told you, it was two accounts. I read her account with her recalling dropping the chips, a piece of the potato in the fat, and then scooping it out with a fork, and then her brother George Speck tasting it and saying, "We'll have plenty of those." That was her account. She recalled the mention of Saratoga chips as an accident. She had chipped off a piece of the potato, which by the merest accident fell into the pan of fat. She fished it out with a fork and set it down upon a plate beside her on the table. Her brother tasted it, declared it good, and said, "We'll have plenty of these." In a 1932 interview with the Saratogian newspaper, her grandson, John Gilbert Freeman, asserted Wicks' role as the true inventor of the potato chip. So her grandson asserted her role as the true inventor of the potato chip. In any event, Speck helped popularize the potato chip, first as a cook at Moon's, and then in his own place, in Malta, called Crumb's. Carrie Moon, owner of Moon's Lake House, where Speck initially worked, later rushed to claim credit for the invention of the potato chip. So the owner, Carrie Moon, the owner of Moon's Lake House, later rushed to claim credit for the invention. I guess he figured it was made in my restaurant, so I invented the chips, and began mass producing the chips. First served in paper cones, then packaged in boxes. They became wildly popular. It was at Moon's that Cleo first tasted the famous Saratoga chips, said to have originated there, and it was she who first scandalized Spa Society by strolling along Broadway and about the paddock at the racetrack, crunching the crisp circlets out of a paper sack as though they were candy or peanuts. She made it the fashion, and soon you saw all Saratoga dipping into cornucopias filled with golden brown paper-thin potatoes. A gathered crowd was likely to create a sound like a scuffling through dried autumn leaves. Visitors to Saratoga Springs were advised to take the 10-mile journey around the lake to Moon's Lake House, Moon's Lodge Lake House, only if for the chips. So people who came to Saratoga Springs were encouraged to go to Moon's and take that 10-mile journey around the lake just to taste the chips. It was worth it, if only just to taste the chips. You didn't have to have the venison. Just go there to taste those great Saratoga chips. The hobby of the lake house is fried potatoes, and these they serve in good style. They are sold in papers like confectionery. So potato chips back then were sold in paper like confectionery, like peanuts or candy. A 1973 advertising campaign by the St. Regis Paper Company, which manufactured packaging for chips, featured an ad for Speck and his story published in the national magazine Fortune and Time during the late 1970s. The variant of the story featuring Vanderbilt became popular because of the interest in his wealth and name, and evidence suggests the source was an advertising agency for the Potato Chip Snack Food Association. Later on, Lay's would popularize these chips, and it said a 1983 article in Western folklore identifies potato chips as having originated in Saratoga Springs. While critiquing the variants of popular stories, in all versions, the chips became popular and subsequently known as Saratoga chips or potato chips. So first it initially called Saratoga chips, then potato chips. The 21st Century Snopes website writes that Crum's customer, if he existed, was more likely an obscure one. Vanderbilt was indeed a regular customer at both Crum's Malta restaurant and Moon's Lake House, but there's no evidence that he played a role in requesting or promoting potato chips. So like I said, we all love chips. We know what chips mean to us. And that Saratoga chip was popularized, by George Speck. So whether it was an accident or whether it was an effort to satisfy and be sarcastic towards a disgruntled customer or dissatisfied customer, being Cornelius Vanderbilt at the time, the potato chips were discovered by George Speck, the crispy Saratoga chips, and popularized and put into mainstream America by George Speck and his sister Kate at Carrie's Moon's Lake House. And then later at George Speck's restaurant, Crum's in Malta, nearby Malta in Saratoga County, New York. So we all love our chips, whether they're Lay's, Sun Chips, unsalted, barbecue, some Chesapeake, Old Bay chips, salt and vinegar. We all love our chips, and especially with a good sandwich. So again, we want to thank George Speck for popularizing these crispy Saratoga chips which we now today call potato chips. Again, thank you. If you like the video, please subscribe or comment. Hit the like button. And we'll see you next time. I'm Ryan Hill. Have a good evening.